Welcome to the Wokelandia podcast, where we are exposing the injustice of social justice. We are the Back Home Brothers. My name is Joseph. I am the younger and better looking. And over there we have.
And I'm Caleb, and I'm the older and better looking. So, how does that work? That we're both better looking?
It's crazy.
That's weird. At least
we identify
equally better looking.
Or your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth. So it's true for everybody, and everybody's happy.
Well, I'm pretty sure Mom agrees with me.
Yeah,
probably.
That's probably true. Actually, that's probably true. Yeah. Well, enough about that.
Enough about that family conflict.
Let's get into Wokelandia. Let's get into wokeness. It's just, every week when you pick this topic, there's just no shortage. But this week, the illustration of wokeness and Wokelandia that we're going to get into happened at the Supreme Court, and it doesn't always happen at the Supreme Court. Sometimes it's like, at Berkeley and like universities. I guess there's a university hook here, of course.
Yeah, there is.
The universities went to the Supreme Court to defend race-based admission policies at the Supreme Court. And so here's basically what happened. And affirmative action debates are not new in the country by any means. And there have been long conversations about whether it's appropriate or inappropriate to do so. Now, the Supreme Court has taken up this question before and said it's not unconstitutional. This challenge is a little unique. It comes from a group of Asian American students who essentially claim that the policies of Harvard and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, these are the two colleges involved in this case, that they consider race as a factor in doing so is illegal, unconstitutional, race-based discrimination.
But it's race-based discrimination against Asians. And if anyone's played the game, you know what the problem with that is, right? It's that nobody cares about Asians.
We can segue into the rules of the game Wokelandia. And if you haven't heard about that, if you don't have that yet, go to wokelandia.com.
That's how it is for the Asians. Nobody cares about Asians. Unlike white people, where people do care negatively in Wokelandia, you get negative points for that.
Well, that really is one of the interesting parts of this lawsuit, because in Wokelandia, like crazy land, where the left wants us all to live, it is true that we do not have to be concerned about the feelings of Asian people or white people. Because they are not the oppressed groups that we are allowed to care about the feelings of. And so that's part of the irony in this. And so the data is actually pretty clear. And during the course of oral arguments, there was one example from the attorney of the plaintiffs who illustrated the situation in this way, that he described the profile of an Asian American male. And with this particular profile that he described, he would have a 25% chance of admission to Harvard. Now, if he changed his race from Asian to white, the exact same profile, everything else being equal, he would have a 36% chance of admission to Harvard. If he changed his race to Hispanic, he would have a 77% chance of admission to Harvard. If he changed it to African American, he would have a 95% chance of admission to Harvard.
So did they contest this? Did Harvard say, no, that's not the case, or did they admit that to be the case?
No, they are not challenging the facts. They agree that, well, I don't know that they specifically said, because that this is, yeah, we agree with those numbers, but they weren't challenged. It's really the facts of these cases are not particularly being contested.
But that's just a huge difference from 95% to 25% or whatever you said.
Of course, yeah.
I didn't get to hear the arguments at all yesterday or 2 days ago when it was. So, yeah.
That was one of the arguments being made. So the question is, and what the plaintiffs are saying is that if I have a 25% chance as an Asian American and I have a 95% chance as an African American, then that's race-based discrimination. The only thing that's different is the color of my skin. You are giving me less of an opportunity because of the color of my skin That's unconstitutional. That's the end of the analysis for the plaintiffs.
Right. Which race is being discriminated against is the question.
Right. So, and in this fact pattern actually is really helpful in describing the rules of Wokelandia, because we know that African Americans in that paradigm are an oppressed group. Therefore, their opinion and their views matter. We're allowed to defend them. Asian Americans generally are not seen as an oppressed groups. Therefore, their feelings don't matter, essentially, right? Despite the Stop Asian Hate stuff that's happening. And that was interesting because outside the Supreme Court, there were some demonstrations. And that was one of the things they were chanting. They're bringing this lawsuit in the name of stopping Asian hate, which is, of course, something that the left was really excited about when they were trying to pin a bunch of Asian hate on President Trump back in was it early COVID, right? When they wanted to shut down travel from China, Nancy Pelosi was saying, oh, go to Chinatown, do all those things, stop Asian hate because Trump is so mean.
Right? And it also came up in the attack when that guy attacked a salon of Asian women in there.
Right.
And they said it was Asian hate, and it was terrible. And the guy, I don't remember if he got shot and killed in the episode, if he got arrested or what. Yeah. But
I don't think he died. I think because afterwards, if the one I'm remembering, this guy was like a porn addict and he was basically like kind of a sex addict, and he was going to all these massage parlors and
it wasn't a salon, was it? It was.
They happened to be primarily occupied by Asian women, and so in his rage and shame, he ended up killing a bunch of them. I don't see that as like an Asian issue. There's a lot going on there that's problematic. But yes, fair enough. Right. That was described as being an Asian hate crime. So
and the question there is if it was a slam or a view of Western civilization in the United States is simply being inherently racist, or if it was actually just a wacko going out and attacking women because he was somehow addicted to porn and thought that was the right way to remedy that.
Whether that's Asian or not, in the fact pattern we're dealing with at the Supreme Court, it is the facts are not an issue. We're dealing with Asian applicants who, based on their test scores and their grades, should be admitted at a much higher rate than they are. The schools themselves have said they are concerned about overrepresentation of certain racial groups, and therefore they have taken it upon themselves to score an applicant down based on their skin color. And how they would do this is part of the application is a personal score, which generally they try to, the first person who sees the application would give them a personal score. They would assess basically integrity, courage, kindness, empathy. These are things that we see about this candidate we think are really good or not so good. And so we're going to give you a personal score. And how they would factor in race is you would get a lower mark on your personal score based on your skin color, which seems obvious, a personal score that's lower because of your skin color seems overtly and obviously racist. The defense of this, of course, Caleb, is that yes, it's discriminatory, but it's appropriate discrimination because we are discriminating. We are engaging in race-based discrimination for good reasons.
To remedy it. And so a couple of questions on that. Justice Thomas was asking, I thought interesting question, and I have a response to it. But one of the things he said was what he was told is without this method, without being able to discriminate based on race, which is what they're doing, we're going to have a less diverse student body. And he said, essentially said, so what's the problem with that? Which is a question that not many people ask.
That will blow people's mind, right? Because it's axiomatic that having something, everything being diverse is inherently moral.
Right. And
we don't challenge that assertion at this point. But
I don't think they gave an answer to that. He was just like, well, it's obvious that you would want to have a more racially diverse student body. And he said, why? Why is that good? And some people have just decided that some certain categories need to be represented. Like they don't check for how many left-handed people are at the school. It's not important to have a diverse number of left-handed people or right-handed people in the school. I mean, there's a million categories we could potentially break people into, and how tall or how short. I mean, how many people are over 6'3" at this school? They don't even track that. They don't know. And so those aren't categories that matter, but they've got their categories that matter. And they want to make sure, do they want to make sure those categories are represented or affirmed as good? I don't know. It kind of depends on the person.
Well, but it's also true that, racial differences have a unique history that left-handedness and height don't, right? And so we're not trying to deny the fact that there's a history of racial discrimination that exists, right, that doesn't exist. There were never laws saying, if you're over 6'3", you can't earn,
So some categories matter more than
we can own you. Right. Categories matter more than others. Fundamentally, the question is there a good kind of racial discrimination and a bad kind of racial discrimination? Because what the 14th Amendment did when we got rid of slavery is we said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. And now what Harvard and the University of North Carolina and a whole bunch of other people and places are trying to do is saying we desperately need racial discrimination to fix racial discrimination. So some racial discrimination is bad, some racial discrimination is good. We'll tell you which is which.
And it kind of goes down to the goal of education of these schools too. Should the goal be to find the best students and best prepare them to best serve in their fields? Or is there some other goal other than that is a more worthy goal to be reached? And you can look at that in the military or in a number of places. What's the goal? Like in the NFL, the goal is clearly to find the best football players and put them on the field, regardless of race. Why is that not the same goal in universities? Because, or not for necessarily for athletes, but for the best possible students for these fields. Nobody has a problem with it in the NFL or in the NBA or in sports, or where outcome is the main consideration. But when outcome is no longer the main consideration, and we have these other considerations that whether it's race or you have other classes too, but in this case it was strictly race, this conversation before the Supreme Court. And so the idea that, well, we need to discriminate based on race, it's hard to defend that. In fact, most people, according to some surveys printed here, most people don't support that. Even people who would at least ostensibly benefit by the idea of their race being selected over somebody else of a different race. If you believe in the idea of race, but we know what we mean when we say that, then most people oppose the idea. And so the Supreme Court's probably going to throw it out. And I don't think the Congress is going to push back against that, which they could, because most people don't want that.
Congress doesn't do anything. They just don't like to do hard things. That being said, I'm not, I don't know what poll you're referring to there. You could certainly find polls that find, depending on how you phrase the question, there are people who support affirmative action. To me, it doesn't really matter if polls like it or polls don't like it. It really does depend on how you're discussing it, how you're framing it, how you're asking the question. But I think each person has to consider the question, is there such thing as good racial discrimination? Mm-hmm. And in the way you stop racial discrimination is by different kinds of racial discrimination, which seems counterintuitive because in some senses it doesn't make sense. And really, what the rules of Wokelandia and what's happening with wokeness and social justice is they're not trying to end racial discrimination. And this is where it becomes really clear. The rules of wokeness, the rules of critical theory, where we have the oppressed trying to be, we have the oppressors trying to the oppressed trying to overthrow the oppressors. All we're trying to do is push back the bad people. That's the dynamic. And if racial discrimination will help us accomplish that goal of overthrowing the oppressors, then racial segregation or racial discrimination is a good thing. If racial discrimination is hurting the oppressed, then racial discrimination is a bad thing. So they don't accept the paradigm that racial discrimination is bad, because nothing is inherently bad and nothing is inherently good, which is why we can burn cities sometimes. Sometimes burning cities is bad. Sometimes burning cities is good. We'll tell you when. It depends on if it's targeted at overthrowing the oppressed, right? And so that's one of the really important parts of wokeness in general, is understanding that nothing is inherently good or inherently bad. It just depends on who's doing it and who's being targeted. If they perceive you as one of the oppressors, then it's bad always, because you're one of the oppressors. It doesn't matter if you're curing cancer, it's bad, right? If you're making money and benefiting from it, then it's bad because you're just using your money and your philanthropy and the good works that you do to just, to defend your power. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's the dynamic where we grew up in a country. I mean, well, we didn't all grow up in a country, but in the last 100 years, we've been trying to beat this drum, right? Racial discrimination is bad. We don't want to do that. We want to treat people based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Here comes social justice to interrupt that, to say, hold on just a second. Sometimes racial discrimination is really good, and we need it because we need it to overthrow the oppressors.
Yeah. And even more than that, it's the fact that you represent. It's not justice in the fact that you yourself or an individual is not getting what they deserve. You are getting what someone else deserved in the past, potentially, or not even based on who you represent. Like we talked about how Black people in the past were denied schooling, whether it's university or even lower level schooling. And that was totally unjust. But now, to make up for that, they'll look at somebody and says, well, you are also Black, so you represent that person, and what that person deserved, you're going to get instead. And so it's a strange imputing of this justice to someone else who really doesn't deserve it on their own merits. They don't deserve that extra treatment. They may deserve to go to school by all means. I mean, public school, obviously, but even university, they may be a good student. And so they certainly could deserve to go because this is a good field for them, and it's a good school for them, and it's a good fit for them, and everything works well for that. But they don't deserve to go because they happen to have the darker skin like someone else in years past, and that person was mistreated. That is completely not just at all.
Yeah.
And the idea that matter. Well, you look like somebody who got to go in the past, and so you don't get to go now. We're going to send somebody else just because you look like them. And that's a bizarre twist of justice, to be treated based on what someone else deserves, good or bad, either way.
And it's all explained by the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, because, again, in very practical terms, when we're talking about college applicants, you're talking about one 18-year-old kid and another 18-year-old kid.
Right.
And we are allowed, under the rules of social justice and wokeness, to feel very sympathetic to the situation of one of those 18-year-old kids. And we are going to celebrate when he gets a chance, due to his skin color. And we're going to be very happy for him because he's getting a chance to do something. Maybe his GPA wasn't quite as good, but whatever. And objectively, we're not mad that student is getting a chance. But what we're not allowed to do is be empathetic and sympathetic to the other kid who is going to be denied this opportunity.
Also because of skin
color. Also because of his skin color, right. Correct. Because the rules of wokeness tell us one of those kids is the oppressors and one of those kids is the oppressed. And we will always take the side of the oppressed. Of the oppressors, of the oppressed, excuse me, I keep mixing those up. And we will be sympathetic to them, and we will be empathetic, and we will celebrate with them, and we will cry with them. But the others, we won't be sympathetic. We won't cry. We don't care. They don't matter. Because of the color of their kin, the color of their kin. I'm doing a really good job with my words today.
Mixing them up. Yes. Well, and that's what it all boils down to. But even worse than that too, is the idea that Thomas Sowell points this out. A lot of people who are preferred into a more rigorous college situation actually aren't ready for that or won't flourish in that. And so it's another injustice on top of the injustice is they're put, okay, here's the situation. We don't have enough Black kids or gay kids, or Asian never comes up, or American Indian kids or whatever. And so we need you to represent your kind. And if you say it that way, it sounds insulting, but that's what it is. And it should be insulting. We need to represent your kind here at this school. But the problem is, they aren't cut out for that. Some people aren't really good at these high-level math or high-level science or whatever it may be. So they go into this situation and they're not prepared and they're not ready, and that's not their field to flourish in, and they don't flourish. If they would have gone somewhere else instead, then they would have succeeded better and they would have flourished in life. You don't have to go to Harvard to have a good life or to flourish or to have a good job or to serve people well. And some people shouldn't go there. Some people shouldn't go to college, period. But when you're pushed into it or accepted into it in a situation where you otherwise would not have been,
as a representative of a class,
the actual individual himself is hurt by this because they're in a situation where they can't flourish. And it's just bad all around.
That's very often the case. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called David and Goliath several years ago, where he talked about that as well. And the thesis of the book is the fact that sometimes things that look like disadvantages are actually advantages. But he also he got into kind of the college world and what happens, that there's a real advantage to being a big fish in a small pond rather than a small fish in a big pond for some people. And people who could have gone as, a bottom 25% quartile applicant to a higher school, they go instead to be a top 25 quartile applicant to a lower tier school. And they actually thrive as a result of that. By the by, but honestly, for me, the outcome of that is a totally separate situation. It's interesting, but it's a separate discussion from the initial question that the Supreme Court is considering is, can you have good racial discrimination?
Right. It is a separate question, but just know that even if it's done, it's still contrary to reality. So much of Oaklandia is contrary to reality. They're fighting constantly against reality. And even if they win, eventually they lose because they're fighting reality. They're not just fighting the courts, they're fighting reality and trying to superimpose your view of the universe that isn't true is going to fail.
So Caleb,
it's going to fail people, and there will be actual people actually hurt.
Let me ask you this question. Then, okay, your scenario wins. The Supreme Court gets rid of this, which means the Ivy League schools have no Hispanic, have no Black kids, not none, but fewer. You're just relegating them once again to second class citizenship status based on a history of discrimination that has made them disadvantaged academically. And you're just fine with that. You just don't care that they're going to basically be a subclass.
Yeah, I don't think it's a subclass at all. It's not a second class. It's probably a better situation. Those who are put into situations where they can flourish are going to do better. And let the market decide that. The idea that you've got a few elites saying this school needs this portion of this representation and this group there, and we got too many of them and too few of them, and you bring in, it's like only God can do that. I mean, who has that kind of knowledge to determine everybody that should be everywhere in life or even anywhere in life?
Right.
Really, it's all of us working together and saying, well, this is not the best fit for you because you're not that great at this subject. You're not that good at math, for example. I'm fine with financial math, but if I was going to try to build a rocket, I wouldn't last very long. And if they put me in because, well, we don't have any back homes in this school. So here, we need a back home to represent. Now you're in rocket class. It's like, yeah, that's not going to go so well for me. I'm not going to flourish there because that's not my thing. Even if you need back homes represented, of course, no one wants back homes represented. It's not a thing. But if it were a thing, it wouldn't be a good thing because it's not going to help. It should be. We should be represented everywhere. But that's my answer to that is it's top-down control, and it's going to fail because they're fighting reality.
Another argument made by the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, they said essentially that the overemphasis on race as an admission criteria is allowing America to avoid the discussion about the education system that they say is failing Hispanic and Black communities specifically, because those are the ones that are underrepresented as a function of the population in higher education. And also, those are the ones that receive this advantage so that they can be more represented in schools than they would be if it was done blindly, just based on test scores and GPAs and essays and those kinds of things. And so the question is, I mean, because another thing that has become axiomatic for the left is that different outcomes, different educational outcomes, different economic outcomes, different even behavioral outcomes. We've seen conversations about how a school that punishes Black kids more than white kids, that's always racist. because you're picking on them, that we're not considering what this particular group of students is doing or what this particular groups of students is doing. Is that basically students have to discipline in a way that is across the board, not based on behavior, but based on skin color.
Some might
right?
be behaving worse than others.
And so the argument is that differential outcome is always racist. And so they would look at the fact that Black students, Hispanic students, Native American students as a group have lower test scores is necessarily a function of racism. It's not the fact that we're not going to look at family structure, which is, from my perspective, certainly going to be relevant. We're not going to look at the fact that those schools might be failing in those communities, and those things are invariably connected, because I don't believe schools can ever make up for a broken home life, right? You can be the best teacher in the world, and if a kid goes home and his dad's beating his mom and they're addicted to drugs, or maybe he doesn't have dad around, no teacher can make up for those disadvantages at home, right? But what I know we will hear back, and even people listening to this would say that no, you are ignoring the difference. It is systemic injustice, systemic racism that has caused the problem. And by trying to pretend, by not giving advantages, you are just allowing that problem to persist in perpetuity forever. And you're just basically not caring.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I mean, it's a totally separate topic, although somewhat related. If we want everybody to have the best education we can, we should have more school choice. Allowing parents to support their children with sending them to the best possible school. That's what happens at university, or what should happen at university for the most part. Happens a lot more there than it does at the primary and secondary levels. And I'd love to see that happen. And it's starting to happen in Arizona and places. But as kids flourish at the younger levels, of course, those who are needing to go to college to prepare themselves well for their career, they'll be able to flourish there as well. And I think that's much more of an issue, is so many poor options for some neighborhoods. They just don't have good options. And a new school coming in, being able to just have a lot more flexibility, that helps a ton. It's, again, a little bit unrelated, but that's a better solution than let's try to discriminate against this race and discriminate in favor of this race when it comes to education.
Yeah. The whole paradigm of good racism, bad racism is, when does that stop? That's the challenge.
Right. And Senator Day O'Connor apparently said that, reading some prep before this, that hopefully this would end in 25 years, she said. And that was back in
I thought you were talking, I was going to say Senator Day O'Connor is no longer on the court, Caleb. It's been a minute.
She was in 2003 when this was argued.
Okay. Fair enough.
She said, yes. I don't like this. Maybe it's necessary still right now. But hopefully it won't be in 25 years and we get rid of it. Well, we're almost to 25 years now. And so some of the justices said, okay, so to the plaintiffs, when would you, or not the plaintiffs, the defendants, when would you want to get rid of this then? If you don't think it's done now, when do you see an end to this intentional discrimination against race? And I don't know that they ever answered that. I don't think they would.
I don't think they will, because in the reality is, again, in the critical race theory, oppressor-oppressed dynamic, it never ends. Right. Because there's always somebody on top, and they are always worth fighting in that paradigm.
Right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, everybody. I think that wraps it up for this topic and discussion of racial discrimination in schools before the Supreme Court. What will happen, we'll find out in June, probably, when most of these decisions come out. Could be earlier than that, but probably in June. My guess is it'll be thrown out. You're looking like you think it'll be sooner than June.
I think it'll be earlier than that.
You think it will?
This one, we're early November. Yeah, it'll be before June.
Okay, well, we'll see. I would love to see it come out sooner, but we'll find out June or sooner. So anyway, thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of the Wokelandia podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again soon. I'm Caleb.
I'm Joseph.
All right, bye-bye.
See you next time.